So our next speaker, which I'm very happy to introduce, is Raffi Stern. Raffi conducts research programs aimed to improve yield and fruit quality of subtropical and deciduous fruit crops. His areas of specialization are reproductive biology, pollination and fertilization, fruit development and abscission, crop load management, high-density orchard planting systems, including rootstocks, and/or growth retardants, and the potential use of PGRs to control everything above. So it sounds like you do everything. But today, what we're going to hear about from Dr. Stern is his work on bumblebees. Raffi. You're muted, Raffi. You need to unmute yourself.
Now you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, so thank you very much, Mary Lou, and thank you very much, Arnon, for the good introduction you gave me to the presentation. It's very, very important. I'm very happy that you did it before, and now I can continue your subject. So I would like to speak today on bumblebee and how they can improve the yield of avocado, and especially Hass avocado. And just some, no, it's not moving. Try to move it. Okay. Some data for the beginning. First of all, the Hass avocado yield is usually very low. Here in Israel, we received about 10 ton per hectare, sometimes 50 ton per hectare, but we think we can get much more. We are sure we can get much more of this. We think that one of the reasons for this low yield is the poor pollination. To overcome this problem of poor pollination, we try to add bumblebee hives to the orchard in addition to the honeybee hive, not instead of, but in addition. So our objective was to try to improve the avocado Hass pollination by adding bumblebee to increase fruit set and yield, or to increase pollination, that increase fruit set and increase yield. Here you can see the bumblebee on the flower, on the avocado flowers. You can see how nice creature is. A very nice, very big one, and very attractive bees. But why bumblebees? What can they do to help us in the pollination? What is the main reason that or the main advantage of the bumblebee as a pollinator, and especially for avocado? First of all, they are very active at a lower temperature than honeybee. You know that honeybees start to work on 50 when it's 50 degrees Celsius, which means I think about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Less than that, they are not going out. The honeybees start to work only when you receive 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And the bumblebee can work in a much lower temperature. And it's very, very important because during the spring, during the flowering season, the temperature sometimes is very low and it's very cloudy. Sometimes it's rain. In this year now in Israel, it's very, very cold. It's like winter. And it's very, very important to have insects that can do, pollinators that can work in a very low temperature. Second thing is that they are very, very quickly, they are active very quickly. They can visit much more flower than honeybee for a given time. We check it on apple trees and on pears and even on lychee, and in each one of the species, they work very, very fast, and they visit a lot of flower, much more flowers than the honeybee. They are larger than the honeybee, about twice larger than the honeybee. So they can carry much more pollen grain on their body, and they can deposit the pollen on the stigma of the flower very easily and much more pollen grain on the stigma of the avocado compared to the honeybee. And the last one, very important, they don't transfer information to each other. They don't know how to do it. Even if one bumblebee go outside the orchard and they find a beautiful, excellent resource, they can find a very good mustard or citrus with a rich flowers that are rich with nectar or rich with pollen or pollen grain. They don't know how to tell their friends how to find this place. If you compare it to honeybee, one honeybee find a good place, they can go back to the hive, they make a special dance and they tell all the 30,000 honeybees that far away from here, that's a very, very good place, and they move out of the orchard. But the bumblebee doesn't know how to do it. And for us, it's very, very, very important feature. So in light of these advantages, we conducted a preliminary experiment in Kfar Giladi during this year, the first year. We took an orchard about 300 meters here and about 100 meters here, the row. And the orchard was with Ettinger, one row of Ettinger, 4 consecutive rows of Hass, and again, 1 row of Ettinger, 4 Hass, and so on. And we put all over the orchard a lot of honeybee hives at this side and this side. But bumblebee, we introduced bumblebee only on one side of the orchard, and we check the yield of the Hass close to the Ettinger. At the close place, at the medium place, this was about 50-60 meters from the bumblebee hive. Here we signed the tree about 120 meters from the bumblebee hives. And here about 180 meters, almost 200 meters from the bumblebee hives. And we wanted to look what's happened to the yield in each distance. And what we found at that year, the first year, we found a very strong relationship between the row distance from the bumblebee hives, okay, and the number of fruit per Hass tree. You can see here that at the closest trees, about 50-60 meters from the bumblebee hives, we received a very high yield, about 400 fruit per tree, which means about 30 tons per hectare. But the yield decreased until here, until 180 meters from the bumblebee hives to about 270 fruit per tree, which means it's about 20 tons per hectare. That was the result for the first year. We just look at the end. We just look how many fruit we received. We didn't do anything at the middle time. So we were very happy of this first year of results. And the second year, we spread the experiment to another orchard. First of all, we did the same experiment on the same orchard on Kfar Giladi the second time, but we measure another orchard. So if we look at the same orchard, Kfar Giladi, but in the next year on the same tree, we can see exactly the same, okay? We see the same trend that the close trees close to the bumblebee hive that was here was the highest yield, and the yield went down and down and down until here, okay? And if we look another orchard on the opposite side of Israel near Haifa in the Western Galilee, in a different area, different weather, different climate, you can see again the same results, very high yield in the closest tree, about between 0 to 70 meters from the bumblebee hives, but it reduced to a lower yield at the medium distance and at the far distance. The control was quite high. This more than 20 tons per hectare, it's quite high, but we showed us to ourselves that we can have a better yield, higher yield. We have no time to speak on all of this. This is a special orchard like Arnon showed you. That's orchard is different, but I have no time to speak about it, but we have the same tree. So we jumped to the third year and we wanted to check a few things. First of all, to do this experiment all over Israel, from the north to the center to the south of Israel, in lots of orchards. Second thing, we tried to understand what's going on, if the bumblebee and honeybee are really in charge of these good results. So we measured the activity of the bumblebee on the honeybee on the tree. We counted how many honeybee, how many bumblebee we can have on the trees in 1 minute. We wanted to find out if there is any correlation between the number of the bee on the tree and the yield. Another thing we tried to do this year was to examine the pollination rates. What does it mean, the pollination rate? It means that we wanted to ask ourselves how many flowers from the avocado received pollen grain. We know that we have a lot of flower, but how many of them received any pollen grain, even one pollen grain? And we also wanted to see on the flower, if one flower received pollen grain, how many pollen grain they received on the stigma. And look here on the results. The first thing I want to show you, the bee activity, how many honeybee and bumblebee we found on the Hass tree and on the Ettinger tree. Ettinger is a pollinizer for the Hass. We can see, if we look at the honeybee, we can see that we have about an average of all over the period. We check it every day, twice a day, all over the period. The average was about 30 honeybee per tree per minute. But if you compare it to the Hass, on Hass avocado, we had about 7 honeybee per tree. That's all. And this, now you can understand, and you understand what's happened, because Arnon showed you before what problem we have in the nectar of the avocado. And maybe the Hass avocado has very high level of potassium. I don't know. This is a project that Arnon has to check and to tell me what's going on. But it's very interesting. This was the result. If you look at the bumblebee, we had the same difference. We had much more bumblebee on the tree on Ettinger compared to the Hass. So the conclusion is that the Hass is less attractive for bees. So if we look at the avocado trees, we know that avocado is not so attractive to honeybee, but Hass avocado is a very, very low attractive to honeybee and to bumblebee. So we really have a big problem. Another thing we checked, we tried to find out what is the difference between the distance, how many honeybee and bumblebee we found in the close distance until say 60, 70 meters from the bumblebee hives, how many was in the medium distance, about 120 meters, and how many of them was far from the bumblebee hives, about almost 200 meters from the bumblebee hives. And what I will show you only the very small result, not all the graph, because we have no time. If we look at the honeybee, there was no difference between distance. The honeybee was spread all over the orchard at the same amount. In the close and the medium, the far distance from the bumblebee hives, there was plenty of honeybee. But if we look at the bumblebee, we saw we saw bumblebee on the trees at the closest distance to the bumblebee, but at the medium distance and the far distance, we didn't see any bumblebee at all. And I am not showing you this, but I want to continue to the pollination rate. On the same tree, close, medium, and distant tree, we check how many flowers received pollen grain and how many pollen grain land on the stigma. So this beautiful picture, you have here 28 pollen grain on the stigma. This is only once from 500 stigma that we checked in the microscope, okay? And usually if we found pollen grain on the stigma, we received usually 2, 3, 4, 5 pollen grain on the stigma, that's all. If you compare it to lychee, for example, I worked a lot on lychee. On lychee, we can find tens of them, sometimes hundreds of them, of pollen grain of the stigma. But in avocado, only this. This is a really, really big problem. If you look at the results of the close distance, medium distance, and far distance, you can see that the pollination rate was quite high, was very high at the beginning, at the close distance, but it's reduced, very low. And the next year, the percentage was much, much lower. It was about 20%, that's all. But on this year, the percentage was high, but it's reduced. But this is very interesting here. How many pollen grain were in the stigma that received any pollen grain? You can see that we have only about 5 pollen grains. That's all at the average from all over the period. Only 5 pollen grain per stigma. And this is a minimum. Today we know that is a minimum to receive a successful fertilization, which give us food. Some researchers say that we need 10, or some of them say that we need 20 pollen grain on the stigma. I found in my work, and also I spoke to David Patemo from New Zealand. He also found this number, and this is the minimum, or I don't know, some of them say optimum, but we need about 5 in order to receive one successful fertilization. But you can see what's happened here. When you are going far to 100 meters from the bumblebee hives, you receive less pollen grain on the stigma. It's not enough to receive food. And let's see what's happened to the same tree with the yield. The same tree that we measure the number of the bee, the number of the bee and the number of pollen grain. And you can see what's happened. You can see that we received in Kfar Giladi the same trees that we check all this data. We had much more yield compared to the medium and medium plus, and also the next place. If you look at the Regba in another yield in Western Galilee, you see very interesting thing. What's happened here? Here, we put the bumblebee hive here, and we put a group of bumblebee here. All this is about 300 meters, and you can see what's happened here. The yield reduced until the middle of the orchard and start to go up when it's closest to the second group of bumblebee. If you see another orchard in the center of Israel, here we had only one group at that side. We didn't have another group here. And at the last year, we tried to examine how many bumblebee hives we have to put in the orchard. What is the density? Because we started with high density. We didn't know. We just want to know if it's help. We say go, no go. It's help or not help. It's make you have more food or you don't have more food. But now after we understand that the bumblebee is very important to us to receive better pollination and better yield, we wanted to know what is the density. If we have to put 5 hive per hectare, or 10 hive per hectare, or 20 hive per hectare, it's very important. So we check in lots of places. I show you only one place, control and 10 hive per hectare, control and 20 hive per hectare. And here in Negba, it's in south of Israel. You can see the control, 5 hive per hectare, 10 hive per hectare, and 20 hive per hectare. This is representative, איך אומרים, ארנון מייצג, represent. This represent a lot of other orchards that show us that 5 hives per hectare, it's not enough. Usually, it's not enough. This year, we got in the same orchard in Negba this year, we received also a better increase in the yield, but this is the best density we think that we need in the orchard. Usually 20 hives per hectare, it's not giving you a more yield. So this is the number in Israel, in our orchard, that we need to put in the orchard in order to receive more yield. And here's the last thing I want to show you is that there is a correlation between the number of bumblebee on the trees, not on the orchard in the hive, on the trees, and the number of the fruit per tree. You can see that if you have about half bumblebee per tree per minute, which means 1 bumblebee per 2 trees in a minute, it's enough to receive the highest yield, the highest number of fruit. That's what we found in Israel. So if we look on the conclusion, we proved our hypothesis that low pollination, we have a problem with pollination, and low pollination is the main reason for poor yield of avocado, at least in Israel. And if we add bumblebee to the orchard, about 10 hives per hectare, we can improve pollination rate and number of pollen grain on the stigma. This is very, very, very important, which increase fertilization, fruit set, and yield. The optimal radius of bumblebee activity from the bumblebee hives is about 50 to 70 meters. It depends on the highest, the biggest tree and the places and the direction of the row, but in average, they can work about 70 meters from the hive. If it's on the row, they can move a little bit more. If it's like this, they can work a little bit less, but on average, it's about 70 meters from the bumblebee hive. If you want to read the article that I just published on plants. And I would like to thank you very much. And also, I didn't have the list of all the people who work with me and helped me a lot, including Arnon, of course, that showed me a lot of, taught me a lot of things about honeybee, about pollination. And if you have a question, if we have time, so I'm here.